Should Judeo-Christian principles be taught in the public schools? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principled case for the libertarian philosophy and has for, well, the show hasn't been doing it for 35 years, Richard, but we've been doing it here at FFF for 35 years, presenting this principle case for liberty. And I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling. Good to see you, Richard.
Richard. Good. It's good to be with you, our viewers and listeners, in these days leading up to Christmas.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure you hadn't lost your voice there, that we hadn't lost your voice. I wanted to remind everybody that this is end of year fundraising time. We'd really greatly appreciate your support. Y'all have kept us going for some 35 years, and I'm very, very honored and very, very grateful. Richard was there at the very beginning of FFF back in 1989 as Vice President of Academic Affairs. And Richard, it's just a nice feeling that we've made it this long, and just hope you all out there will support us again for another year, advancing liberty. All right, Richard. So one of the issues that we're faced with in terms of advancing the free society is with respect to education. And the state plays a very, very dominant role in education, as you know. I'm not just talking about the federal Department of Education, which obviously gets its tentacles into the state's educational system, especially with grants and the strings that come with grants and the standards that come with all that government largesse. But I'm especially talking about the state and local level. We often don't think in terms of the local public schools are a government institution, but they are. This is government running the school system at a local level. The people that are running it are the school board, which is democratically elected politicians running for office to handle the educational matters relating to minors. Now, there's private schools and there's homeschooling, but I don't know what the percentage would be, but I'd say the vast majority of children go to the state's educational system. And then you've got the state Department of Education that is determining things like, school textbooks and the standards and so forth. But all the school teachers and the school administrators and the janitors and so forth, they're employed at the local level by the state, and it's funded by taxation, which, as we all know as libertarians, is coercion. Nothing voluntary about taxes. So I was reading an article where this guy in Oklahoma, I think he's the state superintendent for the public school system. They call it the public school system. Was saying that he is committed to bringing Judeo-Christian values into the public schools. That he obviously thinks that this is a terrible situation, that the public schools are not teaching these Judeo-Christian values, and that he is intent on getting this accomplished. Now, I'm sure there's people out there saying, well, Jacob, what's wrong with that? I mean, are you against Christianity? Are you against Judaism? Are you against the Bible? What's with this? I mean, we've got the state involved in education. Isn't it a good thing that children get educated in a religious sense? What's wrong with teaching them thou shalt not kill and thou shalt not commit adultery and the 10 Commandments and then the Sermon on the Mount? And wouldn't this lead to a better society where children are being inculcated with these right values? And so I sit here and say, well, there's something called the First Amendment that says that we don't want the federal government involved in religion. I mean, that was one of the founding precepts of this country, is we don't want the federal government involved in religion. And so there's that clause there, that we're going to have what is commonly known as a separation of church and state, because people had seen throughout history the problems that you have when you combine state and religion. I mean, the battles are incessant. They often get violent. And so our ancestors said, well, let's just make sure that the federal government has nothing to do with religion at all. No compulsory attendance at churches, no state churches. Everybody decides for himself whether he wants to go to church or not, whether he wants to be religious or not, if he wants to be an atheist, wants to be agnostic, regardless, just leave it to the private sector. However, after the enactment of the Constitution, it was clear that the states could still do these things. That was what the 10th Amendment was all about. The states could force people to go to church if they wanted to. They could have compulsory attendance laws for children and all. Well, that was taken care of by the 14th Amendment, which incorporated the First Amendment and applied it to the states. So now the states cannot do anything with respect to religion. There is a separation of church and state at the state level. Well, there's the rub. Here's this guy, the state superintendent in Oklahoma, that says, but wait a minute, I don't care about that. I want the state involved because this is good stuff that we're teaching the kids. This is Judeo-Christian principles. What's wrong with that? And so he is intent on getting this involved there. Now, so what's the solution to this, Richard? I mean, from a libertarian standpoint, do we tell the state, well, yeah, you can do whatever you think is best. And of course, there might be some local school boards that are predominantly Muslim. Maybe they want to teach Muslim values. How do we resolve that? By majority vote of the school board, or a plebiscite within the citizenry in each school district? Or is it a statewide matter that's being promoted here by this guy in Oklahoma? Well, as a libertarian, I would say let's take it to a different level, a higher level. What business does the state have in education? I mean, and I would argue that the state has no more business in education than it does in religion, or for that matter, healthcare, or any economy, or any other peaceful activity. And so once you separate education in the state, this whole problem goes away. That if you got states, private schools teaching Judeo-Christian principles, great. Parents can send their children to those schools. Or if you have some teaching atheism, children can go to those schools. It's just like in churches, that the educational system would be exactly the same with respect to education. Let the free market reign. What do you think?
Well, I think there's two issues that you've sort of been talking about, and I'll just maybe try to add to or clarify it as I see it. First, there's the issue of, is it the duty or responsibility of the government, including in a government educational system, to be espousing, articulating, indoctrinating all students who are required to have mandatory attendance in a particular set of ideas? The ideas could be political, philosophical, ideological, or religious. And if you do believe that, well, then whose set of ideas shall be the ones to be imposed upon everyone in the society? Now, you could say majoritarian, but does that mean a simple majority, or does it mean a 2/3 majority? And even if it were to be a 3/4 majority, or 99 point everybody within a school district, what about those who dissent from this, who share other religious values, or as you were suggesting, no religious values? Are their rights to be superimposed upon, in fact, to be crushed, merely because a numbers game has determined that others want their values to be inculcated rather than that lonely one? That would be inconsistent with the philosophical principle upon which the country was founded, and is also reflected in that First Amendment that you alluded to. And that is, the country is founded on the principle of individual liberty, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So certainly the pursuit of happiness is discovering, following, proselytizing for, and educating one's own children things that they think happiness will provide. And one of them is a sense of direction, purpose, values, which can come either philosophically or religiously. And if you do believe that rights reside in the individual, and he is to have his liberty to pursue his happiness, which can include religious senses, then what right does either a king, the rule of the one, or the majority in a school district or in a state, the rule of the many, what right does that have, either one of those have the authority to impose their wishes, values, or beliefs on that lone individual? So that gets to the very basis upon which the country is founded: collective rights or individual rights, individual autonomy or collective decision making, superimposed upon those who lose the election. It's everything becomes just a mob numbers game. But separate from that, once we take the attitude that there's going to be a monopoly government educational system, and that all students within that district will be required by law to attend, and once that school district, as a monopoly source of education, has the authority to determine the curriculum, which includes teaching of religion, if that's what a majority wants, then it becomes an unending fight for control of the state. And in this case, the state's educational establishment. Shall my values be imposed, or shall your values be imposed? Will there be a pledge of allegiance at the beginning of the day, or no pledge of allegiance? Will we have a reading from the Bible or not? And is it to be the Christian Bible or the Hebrew Bible or the Quran or some sacred Buddhist or Hindu text? Uh, it's going to be an unending fight of control to have the authority and the power to impress one set of beliefs on all, regardless of what the others may want, desire, or disagree about. It becomes an unending fight. We've seen this. Will it be evolution or will it be creationism? That became a big fight for a long time in school districts. Will there be a Pledge of Allegiance or not? That became a big fight in school districts. What will be the history curriculum? Will Christopher Columbus be a hero or a villain? Shall it be standard American history or politically correct identity politics history? Once the state has a monopoly, then it's the only game in town, and either you control it or the other side controls it. It's an unending fight for political power and manipulation, which tears the society apart. If I can just add to broaden that, everyone says that America seems increasingly politically polarized, divisiveness, friends and families unable to share social space because of differences of political or ideological beliefs. Why? Because everything is being politicized. There is no private space. Private space means the free civil society. You go to the church that you want. You join the private association or charitable organization you want. You work for that employer as opposed to this employer. You live in this community or that community. Uh, all of these things are meant to be private choices, and in a free society are private choices. And therefore, since no one can impose their values upon you, nor can you have the political authority to impose your values on them, you depoliticize all these problems. You take politics out of it. It's the denationalization of social relationships. And unless you want this continuing polarization, and unless you want this continuing fighting for power and control, the only way we can solve these problems, including this gentleman in Texas, who
Oklahoma.
in Oklahoma, who desires a religious education for his child, but is going to be fought tooth and nail by those who hold different, even Christian beliefs or non-Christian beliefs or no beliefs. The only way to do it is, at the end of the day, is what you were suggesting, Jacob, and that is the separating of education and the state. That is, that the burden and responsibility and authority for education relies with young people and through their parents, the parents for their children. You send your child to the school that you value, that has the curriculum, the standards, the benchmarks, the point of view that you think will be best for your child to have a prosperous and successful and meaningful adult life. And another person sends their children to that one. And you just allow the market to provide the diversity and the variety of the educational establishments that reflect the pluralistic views of multitudes of different people in the society. Uh, we take that for granted with clothes, with food, with now watching multitudes of channels on streaming television. Everybody follows the course and the preferences and the values and the alternatives that they find attractive, meaningful, and of value to them. And they leave their neighbors alone. And all of that diffuses the controversies and the conflicts and the infighting. And if we were to do that with such hotspots as education, plus numerous others that have become politicized in our society today, the society would become calmer, more peaceful, less hostile, and less conflict-based or confrontational as it has been between friends, families, and communities today.
All right, well, you put the issues very well, but let me hit you with just a practical problem here in terms of advancing liberty. We're libertarians. You and I have been advancing libertarianism for at least 35 years here at FFF. You've got young people who have children in public schools. Now, we know that homeschooling is an option, private schools are an option, but a lot of people can't afford the private schools. They're very expensive. Some do not feel competent in terms of homeschooling. They can't hire a tutor, they don't have the money. So they default to the public school system. So when someone asks me on some of the issues that you raised, like the Pledge of Allegiance, or let's say, should the students be required to wear uniforms to public schools, or should the state be, should the public school principal be allowed to open up lockers of the students? And they say, well, what's your position on this, Jacob? I mean, one answer is no, I think the Pledge of Allegiance should be optional. No, I think they have a privacy right in those lockers. No, I don't think a uniform's appropriate if it's not the military. But my default position is that, look, I'm not here to tell the state how to run its operations. It's like what you say. How do you decide these? There's no way to come up with a black and white answer that's going to satisfy everyone. It's necessarily going to be arbitrary and it's going to be capricious. But most important, I want people to stay focused on what the ultimate answer is here, and that's getting government out of education. If we as libertarians permit ourselves to get mired down in these disputes on how public schooling should work, then people get the perception, oh, libertarians are against the Pledge of Allegiance, or libertarians are for, reasonable searches and seizures. I want people to stay focused on getting the government out of education. And so that my default position is almost always, look, I'm not going to tell the state how to run its operations. I want the state out of education entirely. Now, I make an exception on religion, though. The First Amendment clearly says, and incorporated by the 14th Amendment, that there will be a separation of church and state. And I think religion is sort of in a category all of itself. We don't want the state involved in religion. It's one thing for the state to be teaching evolution or creationism or Pledge of Allegiance or not, but to me, religion is one of those lines you don't cross with the state. Now, you've raised it with me oftentimes before that there's young libertarians that have children in public schools, and they want to make sure that the school is doing the things that they think are important. So they'll go to a school board meeting and say, well, I think you're wrong to do this and do this and do this. And I don't have any problems with that. I mean, I can understand why a parent would feel that way. What I have problems with is when they go there and they say, I'm a libertarian, and this is we oppose the Pledge of Allegiance. Well, that's not what libertarianism is all about. Libertarianism is about if anybody wants to do the Pledge of Allegiance, they're free to do that, including adults, 50 or 60 years old, if they want to do it in their homes or in their private clubs. I think that when libertarians do this, they go to the public school meeting, the board meeting, or they back candidates, that they ought to just do it as a private citizen, as a parent, and leave libertarianism out of it totally, so that people don't get the perception that this is what libertarianism is. I think the more that libertarians stick with advancing libertarianism as a separation of school and state, the better off we are and the closer we are to getting what we need to be achieved for a free society, and that's the separation of school and state.
Obviously, the libertarian or the classic liberal doesn't have a view per se as a policy on should there be a pledge of allegiance or not. Because, as you're saying, the government shouldn't be even in the educational system, and that just becomes a fight over what values you hold versus someone else's. But I want to pick up on the point that you just said. The fact is that parents have children, and their children only have one shot at some kind of education when they're young, leading to their adulthood and moving out into the world as an adult person. Um, and Often people, either because of their financial circumstances or because of their lack of time, can't send their own kid to a private school or to homeschool, which leaves them by default having their child falling into the public school system. And I think that there's nothing wrong if you, it's sort of like the government runs the highway system. So are people going to drive on the left side or the right side of the road? Well, I lived in Ireland for a while, and I was used to riding on the left side of the road, though here in America and most other countries, I drive on the right side of the road. Whether it's on the left or the right is inconsequential. What's important is, should the government be in the road business? As a famous 19th century American economist named Francis Amasa Walker said, uh, the issue is, do you believe in road socialism? Socialism. That was his phrase, not mine. Road shows a different way economists would express things back in the 19th century. And what he was getting at is that roads should be private. And those who want to ride on roads will pay a fee. If they ride a lot, they'll pay a lot of tolls. If they ride very little, they'll pay fewer tolls. And if they don't ride at all, they don't pay any tolls. Rather than one group of society being forced to fund a means of communication that they either have little or no use for, or are not being placed in the areas that are most convenient for them as opposed to somebody else. And this is the same thing with education, it seems to me. As a private parent, as you were suggesting, you're concerned with the quality of your child's education as you see it. And you may go to a local school board meeting and make the case for what you consider to be a better curriculum. But it becomes dangerous if you say, well, as a Republican, I believe, or as a Democrat, I believe, or as a Libertarian, I believe. That they're not completely separate. It would be impossible to say it's completely separate. But I believe there's a practical and pragmatic matter. Uh, Political labels should be left at the door of the Board of Education building, and you're just going in and having to deal with the fact that your kid is locked into a monopoly system, and you can't get out of it because the state mandates it and is forcing you to pay for it. So you're debating as a private citizen what you think the curriculum should be. But once the labels are thrown around, this is another level of the further monopoly politicization of the process. But we cannot discount the fact that a parent is concerned with what their child is learning. And if the state locks you up into a prison, and some people have called mandatory education to be a 12-year sentence, there's no way a parent as a private individual cannot be unconcerned about what their child is learning.
Yeah, let's address another aspect of this, the poor. I mean, it's always said that, oh, well, if you got the state out of education, how would the poor get an education? Well, it shows what going with socialism does to people's faith and freedom. I mean, freedom produces the best of everything. The free market produces the best of everything. We see that in so many walks of life, and yet we lose that faith when it comes to something that we've all been born and raised under, which is systems of public schooling. I have no doubts that if we'd had a system of state churching since the beginning of the United States, comparable to state education, the government has mandatory attendance laws for children to attend church on Sundays, and parents have to send their kids to the churches. State-supported churches, a voucher system for parents that want to send their kids to private churches. That if you and I came along under that system and said, "Why don't we just get the state out of religion entirely?" People would respond with, "Where would the poor go to church?" The poor would have the churches would only be for the rich people. Well, if you look at our system, everybody takes it for granted. The poor don't have trouble finding churches to go to. I don't know of one church that denies admission to poor people or to people that don't donate one dime to that church. And it's all by donations. You know, they don't receive state funds, these churches. Some of them go out of business. There's no question about it, but that's the way it is. I mean, when you're living in a society that's based on voluntary charity. But the poor find places to go to church. There's no question about it. Well, I say the same thing would happen in education. I mean, there's wealthy people and middle class people that care about educating poor people, helping them out with scholarships and fellowships, or funding a school that says, "I want to endow this," and you all make the decision as to who comes into the into the school. That you set the scholarships, but I'll fund it. And I have no doubt that that kind of system would absolutely flourish. It's just that we've lost faith in it because we're so accustomed to the state coercion in education.
Yeah, and if it seems pie in the sky, I would just draw our viewers and listeners' attention to a very interesting book written by an economic historian named Edwin G. West, E.G. West, and it's called Education in the State. It was written back in the 60s or 70s. But the point is that he was looking at the role of government in education in Great Britain, beginning in the 18th and into the 19th century, the 1700s and the 1800s. And he basically showed that in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, starting even before then, but in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, long working hours, certainly low pay by our standards today, people were uneducated, illiterate for the most part. 95% of the population would not have been able really to read or write. But it was in during this period of, let's say, from 1790 to around 1830 or so, that Edwin West and his archival researches was able to deduce that approximately 2/3 to 3/4 of the entire British population was made literate in that 40-year period without state mandated education in a condition that we would consider horrendous poverty, where 90% of the population, certainly 85% of the population, lived in abject poverty still. And through either church schools or some non-secular charitable schools, or some beginning paying schools, uh, the virtually the entire British population was made literate uh, by the standards of that time, and often with reading literature that was more sophisticated and more complex and more demanding than, to be honest, I think a lot of children get in grammar school today. And that was all done without the state. No subsidies, no vouchers, no school choice. This was just the private sector, totally. And in fact, that was the emergence, West also explains, of the mass, inexpensive news media. Now, back then, right, there's no radio, no television, no internet. So it's the old-fashioned printed newspaper. And it was called the penny press. Modern machinery and development enabled, mass production of newspapers and the old-fashioned printing presses, and that mass volume to be able to have enough to sell them for a penny, because there was this huge demand for people to read, and that's because they were being made literate, and that was the beginning of mass media. So all of these are demonstrations from history that it's not only possible, but in fact happened. And if the state had never been in education, uh, as it began to be in the 19th century under the influence of mandatory Prussian educational ideas that were imported into the United States, I would argue that not only would we have a vast diversity of education, a depoliticized educational system along the lines we were talking about earlier, but that the quality of the education, the competitive drive for improvement in curriculum, in pedagogy, right? The methods of teaching to make subjects interesting and memorable for students, uh, to prepare them just to have an inquisitive mind and careers later on, would be far greater than anything we see today.
No, that's a great analysis, and I would point out to the viewers the university that you used to teach at, Hillsdale College. It's at the college level, but the principle applies equally to the local level, to state level. That Hillsdale takes no federal funds or state funds at all to fund its operations; it's entirely voluntary. And that many years ago, the federal government said, "Ah, we got an opening. Your students take government grants, and so we can control your admissions department." And so Hillsdale lost in the courts on that issue. And so Hillsdale said, okay, we'll just prohibit our students from taking government grants. And of course, the natural reaction would be, oh gosh, now those students aren't going to get any kind of education. They're going to have to drop out. Hillsdale had a massive fundraising campaign, all voluntary, that funded those students and continued funding students on a voluntary basis so that today the institution, much to the chagrin of the federal government that hates just one independent university in the country, does not have any control over that institution. Just it gives you an example of how freedom works and how the free market works. Okay,
Exactly. Freedom at the end of the day is not only a moral principle to believe in and follow, but is one that has the practical ability to solve virtually all social problems.
yeah, that's a great point, Richard. I know we're about out of time, but I mean, why shouldn't parents and families be in charge of the education of their children rather than the state? Okay, on that note, Richard, we'll wrap things up. Again, thank you all very much for tuning in. Thanks for your support. If you've already sent us a donation, please keep us in mind before the end of the year for your generous tax deductible donation. We would be greatly appreciative and very honored, as we have been for 35 years. Richard, look forward to talking to you next time.
Till next time.